our lives are predictable with relatively manageable amounts of stress. The stress we do experience is usually woven into the fabric of our lives in such a way that we can easily adapt to it. Numerous stressors have become a part of everyday life for many of us. We are even fully capable of adjusting to the minor unexpected calamities we occasionally experience. As human beings, we are amazingly adaptive creatures who have a unique ability to assess our situation and develop creative strategies for responding to it. However, sometimes life presents unpredictable and traumatic events. Sudden tragedies that threaten our survival or those we are close to can have a devastating effect on us. When a trauma occurs, it can shatter all our assumptions of what we expect life to be, leaving us disoriented and overwhelmed. The scars that remain might be physical and/or psychological. One form of psychological scarring is post-traumatic stress disorder. Although there are literary references dating back to the 1600s, what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder was first clinically described in 1871 by Dr. Jacob DaCosta, a physician who examined returning Civil War soldiers. He called it irritable heart syndrome because of the severe heart palpitations and anxiety. Also in the late 19th century, an increase in the number of train accidents led some physicians to label the disorder as railway spine, based on the idea that injury to the spine during a train accident brought about the symptoms. Shell shock was the term used after World War I to describe the depressive-like symptoms experienced by traumatized soldiers. Throughout the 20th century, numerous labels have been assigned to a similar set of symptoms. Battered wife syndrome, rape trauma syndrome, and Vietnam vet syndrome all have been applied to the disorder we now know as PTSD. In Boston, Massachusetts, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk is director of the trauma clinic at the Lindemann Mental Health Center. Dr. van der Kolk is a leading expert in the study of trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah, what's traumatic for one person is not necessarily traumatic for somebody else. The critical variable is the personal meaning of an experience. And the other thing is what sort of biological disposition people bring to it. If people are already pretty on edge or pretty frightened or tired or inebriated, they're much more likely to really get a severe jolt by a terrible experience than when people are basically thinking clearly, in good shape, and can sort of figure their way out of a terrible situation.
By rights, I should be dead, because it was 13,800 volts of electricity that went across my shoulder, where I got blown on the floor and thrown across the floor. It hit my head on the wall, knocked me out. A bolt went in my arm, but it didn't puncture my arm. It went between right in here, and my arm was swelled out. I mean, the blow up itself, it sounded like I was in a jet engine and being roasted like a turkey. There was so much heat, there was so much flame, that it had a problem. It crossed over to 2 circuits. So it didn't just blow up 1 circuit. I was in there when it blew up 2 circuits. And I couldn't get out because I got knocked out the first time, and the second time they knocked me out again. I thought I was dead. And I don't know how I got out of there. Even the people that are at the substation, the electric company, they still didn't know how I got out and I was alive.
My trauma began on August the 2nd when the Iraqi forces invaded Kuwait, and I was living in my apartment at the time, getting ready to go to work about 6 o'clock, and I was awoken suddenly by mortar fire and this sort of thing about 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning. The next phase I went through was the phase of hiding. It became very clear that I couldn't stay in my own place there, so I began to basically try to find safe haven around Kuwait. I had to dye my hair. I had to wear Arabic women's clothes with the veils because as a Westerner, we were very early on the targets of a search, an intensive search. The situation kept like this, and I was about 2.5 months in hiding in Kuwait. I've often thought that the hiding was the worst part of my total experience. They came about, the Iraqis came about 6:15 in the morning on the 21st, and they completely surrounded the place we were, and they were all armed, and there weren't any less than 50 or so armed soldiers with machine guns beating on the windows, and so I knew my time had come. It's time to go to the camps. So this began very, whatever was bad before, it suddenly got worse. I was watching another television program, and the news was on another channel, and some of the other hostages came running over saying, your sister is on the news. I quickly switched it to and caught the Persian news, and they mentioned my sister's name, that she was coming from America to visit her brother, what they said. At this point, I knew that my family was really actively trying to do something to get me out. Eventually, as you know, my release was a bit complicated. I was the first American released under those circumstances. I had to meet Saddam Hussein personally. This was not a very enjoyable situation. We had everything to fear and nothing to expect from this, because this man has the power of life and death. And so he personally released me. And at this point, I had a lot of mixed emotion.
The National Center for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder was established in 1989 as a branch of the Veterans Administration. As Associate Director of the Behavioral Sciences Division, Dr. Jessica Wolf has studied both civilian and war-related trauma.
There seem to be two things that make a traumatic experience traumatic on a broad basis. One is the severity or intensity of the event. For example, the degree to which it encompasses life threat and things like physical harm or violence. The second element is the degree to which that particular person feels or perceives the event to be traumatic. So what is traumatic to me may not be personally traumatizing to somebody else, although it may be distressing to them. So I would say that there's a very strong person-situation interaction in the development of PTSD. There are many people who feel that the reaction to stress is really the normal response of a person to an abnormal situation or event. Hence, it's not pathological.
Well, my trauma was rape, and we were on vacation in the Caribbean, and we were staying at a hotel, and I was walking by myself from the hotel to the beach along the pathway that connected the hotel to the beach, and I was attacked at knife point from behind. And that was sort of an area where many people traveled over the pathway, but at that time there just happened to be nobody walking along the pathway. And so I was raped there, and you know, consequently we needed to stay the rest of the week, and we went to trial, and we went back to the place a couple of months ago and went to trial again because the person had jumped bail, and he ended up getting 9 years and corporal punishment also. So we did see justice done, but it was sort of a long haul to get there.
My son was murdered in a barbershop in Roxbury, in the Eglinton Square area. He was 24 years old, and we was very close. We have an exercise program for the church that I belongs to, and I was there, you know, giving the exercise class, and my daughter called the church, and somebody told me telephone, so I went to the phone, and it was her, and she told me that he had got shot, and he was at the Boston City Hospital. I immediately went over to the Boston City Hospital and confronted with the doctors that was in charge, and they set me down and told me that he had expired. It was very devastating to me that it happened. Most of all, and even more so, the way it happened was very devastating. That, you know, somebody walked right into the barbershop in the midst of 15 to 20 other people and gunned down one individual. It was quite dramatic. So when I went back to work, all those realities started setting in all at once. And that's when I began to realize that, wow, it's really nothing that I could do but wish and hope.
The night of the fire, I watched my brother burn to death, saw him engulfed in flames, knew what to do, knew it was too late to do anything about him. So let's get the people who are still alive safely out, and that's exactly what I did. And they brought out my mom and dad's body. I knew that they were okay. The last body that they brought out was my brother's. And that was a very horrible sight. And they placed him on the front lawn and put a white sheet over him after they had done everything they could to revive him. But I remember thinking that night and shaking my head and saying, no, he's already dead.
The symptoms that comprise PTSD can be grouped into 3 distinct categories: re-experiencing, numbing or avoidance, and hyperarousal. Some of the common re-experiencing type symptoms include nightmares and flashbacks.
What is thought to happen is that during trauma, when someone is very, very aroused, that the events are processed in a sort of hypercharged way, which then interconnects these memories of these events in a very specialized network. And that network is easily re-triggered when they're feeling very anxious or re-aroused by some external stimulus or an internal stimulus that reminds them of the particular event. And that brings back sort of the flood of memories in a kind of almost a domino theory. For example, thinking about the event or aspects of the event when you don't want to, either consciously during the daytime as intrusive thoughts or without control during the nighttime in the form of recurrent nightmares.
When I go to bed at night, it's a very long period of trying to get my body to relax, to accept some sort of peacefulness that I can go to bed on. And I was interrupted almost continuously with nightmares for the better part of the first 3 months that I was free. It did not end with my release.
I think becoming frightened by them is the hardest part, because they're very dramatic and they're very real, and you have to accept that they're very real. But in general, the nightmares were the kind of nightmares where I would wake up feeling very terrified, and most of the nightmare would come back to me, and generally it was somebody who was chasing me or threatening me with a weapon, pretty much similar to the scenario that had actually occurred. They changed, though, after I started seeking help and started analyzing some of the things that were happening to me. The nightmares became the kind of nightmares where I would get some retaliation at the end.
A central aspect of trauma is that memory gets interfered with. People remember either too much, and it keeps coming back in the forms of flashbacks, nightmares, intrusive experiences, or they remember too little. Unlike when you ride a bicycle on a nice Sunday afternoon, you do not go back to that experience over and over again. The memory for that is there. It doesn't have much of an impact on the rest of your life, and maybe sometime 5 years later you may remember some nice sunny spring afternoon. But the issue with trauma is that the memory of that particular event comes to haunt you. It keeps coming back over and over again.
The flashbacks today entail someone going through the same fire, coming down over the same flight of stairs and seeing a brother,
engulfed in flames. Smelling. Burnt flesh. The flashbacks have somebody sitting on the bottom stair and crying and saying, "Oh no, oh no."
The numbing and avoidant group of symptoms can include efforts to avoid activities or situations that arouse recollections of the trauma, feelings of detachment or estrangement from others, a restricted range of affect, for example, the inability to have loving feelings.
The people who are actually traumatized have a restricted range of feelings. They're able to feel fewer feelings, and certainly fewer positive feelings, than someone who's not traumatized. And they may feel flat or blunted in a number of situations. They may also have something we call behavioral avoidance, which is that they would tend to avoid or not go into social or physical settings that in some way remind them of the original traumatic event. So they're restricted in how they can function.
Where he got killed at, I had to go past that place every day to work because it's right on my way to work. And for maybe 2 months, I would find myself avoiding it purposely. And that was the only thing that I started avoiding because it was so painful to go past there. At that place that I had been going past every day and find out that he had actually got killed there. And I could just see in my own vision them bringing him out on the stretcher, you know. But after I started going past there every day, I still think of every day I go past there, but it's not, you know, it's not as painful as it was before.
For a time, I could only drive very fast on my street, slow down in front of my home where the fire was. Just Christmas Day passed. Only a few weeks ago, I was able to walk and stand in front of my house and look up at it, with the help and aid of a very large dog on a leash.
I think that traumatized people become the loneliest people in the world. Most people feel terribly ashamed for somehow allowing these uncontrollable things to happen to them. Often, they are too ashamed about what happened to them to tell anybody. They live with a secret and feel like they cannot really share what's foremost on their minds with anybody. And that isolates them in a very profound way. Many people who lock themselves up in their emotional shell cannot experience even the most elemental pleasures. They may look at their children and say, yes, I know that these are my children, but I don't really feel this sort of attachment that I hear one is supposed to feel, or that I was able to feel before this terrible thing happened to me.
There is this distinct feeling when I first got free, and it lasted for a period of time. It is sort of a numbness. I'm sort of immune to feelings, and almost anything that happens, it's relative to what I've been through. It's almost insignificant at this point in time. I really don't feel. I don't laugh. I don't feel like I felt before.
I had a lot of difficulty pretty much enjoying any function or anyone. If I go to a function that was happy, for example, I would wait for something sad to happen. It was kind of like walking around waiting for the next ball to drop. It was sort of a constant feeling of doom. I would sort of drive someplace and be worried that something bad was going to happen. My car would break down. I would get into an accident. I would go to a wedding and say, well, how come these people are so happy and I feel so sad? The thing that I wanted the most was to feel closer to these people, but it was harder to feel closer to them because I felt so awful I couldn't let myself get close enough.
Among the hyperarousal symptoms are difficulty falling or staying asleep, exaggerated startle response, hypervigilance, irritability or outbursts of anger,
Kind of autonomic reactivity seen in things like exaggerated startle response to unexpected loud noise, feeling very irritable or jumpy a lot of the time, having marked trouble sleeping, kind of general dysfunction in regulating yourself physiologically.
You hear things, you jump, you're awful jumpy. I'll tell you, anybody walks behind you, you jump. I mean, you get very sensitive and protective of yourself as being jumpy. And people don't realize a loud noise like a fireworks, you jump. I mean, then you try to hide or something. And I'll always sit, as you'll notice, my back towards a wall or something. So people don't realize that that's a phobia now that I still have from the PTSD, is I don't like sitting with my back against people.
For a long time, every time the phone rang, I would thought something was bad was happening, something was bad behind. And every time I hear a firecrack or a sound of a gunshot, I would think of, I would actually jump. So that was real. I felt that for a long time. I felt that.
My sleeping is sleep for an hour, wake up, sleep for an hour, wake up. I'm constantly checking the home to make sure that everything is okay.
You'd go to bed, say, 11 o'clock and sleep for 2 hours, and the rest of the night you're up and wandering and rolling and tumbling, and you'd come downstairs to try to get something to eat or drink, and sometimes that would happen, sometimes it wouldn't.
It seems like everybody who gets traumatized loses their basic trust in the justice and the predictability in the world. They're suspicious of other people and suspicious of their own happiness. When things are going well, they wait for the next shoe to drop and for it all to be ruined again.
And anyone could turn me into the authorities, and I just found myself, from that point in time until now, there is this sense of losing some of the closeness that I normally have with people. I used to make friends very easily, and I felt a very open person. But now I have a certain amount of suspicion that really people, when the chips are down, they'll drop you in a heartbeat. And that's sort of an effect of what I went through.
And plus the rape occurred during the daylight, and so daylight wasn't sacred anymore. Usually people think, well, if you're attacked at night, the daytime's still okay. But for me, no time was okay.
In fact, I became very paranoid for a period of time. Every time I go outside, I feel like somehow being watched. And I know that was just paranoia. I thought it was paranoia. I feel like something was going to happen to me. When I would stop at a red light, driving down the street, it looked like to me everybody, the people next to me was watching me,
One of the basic biologically based disruptions of trauma is that it causes people to be unable to regulate how much or how little they feel. Traumatized people cannot push those sensations away, and everything impinges on them. They get irritated by anything, and they cannot, their brains, this is really not something that the mind does primarily, it's really a biological function. Their biological functions cannot say, don't worry about it, it's not important, just keep your mind on what's really important right now.
Tears and anger are the top two that seem to be there right now for me. Sometimes I see it, I slam doors, do things with a very ferocious energy, it's anger, snap at someone, has nothing to do with those particular situations.
When I became free, I found myself with anxiety, but only in the sense that I was frustrated and I was depressed. I became sometimes irritable around those who love me. I don't know the reasons, really. I just found myself short-tempered often, and not as patient as I should have been with situations that someone didn't cause a problem.
I would have a lot of anger about things that were seemingly very inconsequential, but to me, they were a big deal. But sometimes I would know that I was getting angry, or that I was being irritable, or that I was being sort of unnecessarily harsh, mostly to the people that I cared about, but I knew I was doing it. And I knew there was no reason why. I just was doing it. And that to me was very frustrating, because I couldn't explain, especially to my husband, why I was acting this way. But yet I knew that I was overreacting in some sense.
The after effects of a trauma often touch the survivor's family and friends as well.
Oftentimes families get very messed up around something terrible happening to somebody. People feel ashamed, they feel like they have let a person down, they blame the victim oftentimes, and oftentimes they don't really know what to do.
It also affects your family. Like the both kids, it affects, and they'll never forget it. Not the way what happened to me in the blow-up. Because when they thought the blow-up, and they thought their father was dead, well, a lot of things that I can't do with the kids, it really makes me feel hurt because I can't do them with them. I feel it just as much as they do, because now they have a father, but they don't have a complete father.
As I started coming out of this, the first month or so when I was back, I kept getting these comments from friends and family. Well, listen, you have to get this behind you and sort this out, because, listen, it's over. And, you know, so there's this sense of, you know, they really want to help. They really do want to help. But that's not the type of conversation I was needing at the time.
I think that the experience of having been raped affects everybody that's close to you. I had some friends who tried to be helpful by avoiding it, figuring that if I didn't talk about it, everything would be okay. And that would make me feel even worse, because I would feel like they thought I was more of an outcast than I already felt myself. But the nicest thing, really, I think that happened was one of my sisters-in-laws said, I didn't really know what to do when I heard this happen to you, but I called the Rape Crisis Center just to ask them what to say to you. And for her to do that made me feel like, wow, someone really cares and someone's really reaching out. And just to know that somebody is thinking about how painful it must be, that was the best thing for me.
Treatment for PTSD often involves a combination of therapeutic approaches, ranging from individual and group therapy to medication and physical exercise.
A safe space needs to be created in which people can feel and in which people can talk. Talking is very, very important, because the traumatic experience is by essence a speechless terror. It is something that is so horrible that it's hard to talk about it. And people need to slowly find words in which they can frame the meaning of the trauma. An amazing thing happens when people are able to put things into words. Initially, these experiences are located in people's bodies. They feel bad. Their chest, their muscles, their stomachs are all involved in the horror of what has happened to them. And as people find words to express it in, it gets taken out of the body and it's put into the mind. It becomes an experience that people have had, rather than an experience that people keep reliving over and over again. And by putting it into words, both the things that are remembered too clearly and the things that are not remembered enough are allowed to form one cohesive, what we call narrative. A tale, a story gets told. A story of woe, but a story that needs to be told to people.
And finally, I had called a trauma center, because I needed help. I mean, my wife just said, that's it. She was ready to throw you out of the house because I was yelling and screaming at the kids. Anything I did was not normal. I mean, it was just getting worse and worse. I'll tell you, it just you can't beat help from somebody else. That, like, it's unreal. I mean, I could never have done it by myself. I mean, I would have been in that house.
When I started approaching the specialist in this area of trauma, it was such a relief to just have someone that you know can understand. Though I didn't go very many visits to this type of therapy, I strongly recommend it because I noticed results from like the first and second visit. I started to have a calmness within myself. I remember one of the nicest things one of the therapists told me was, this is normal to have some of these feelings. I was having this conflict with myself that I'm doing all these irrational things, that the things I'm doing are totally not normal. It's not normal to respond like this in normal life, to isolate yourself. It's not normal to feel depressed. It's not normal to have insomnia. But here I have a specialist telling me, wait a minute, that's not so abnormal. Think about what you've been through. And, you know, it was sort of a sense of calm, and I started to feel myself living again.
Initially, I sought out a therapist that I had heard about and that I had worked with, and it was okay, except after a few sessions, I was feeling very apprehensive to go because the central theme that came out every time I would go was she didn't know much about PTSD, and she would say to me, you're afraid of sort of losing it, so to speak, aren't you? And I'd go away feeling like I really was afraid of losing it, and I would feel more and more insecure. And finally I reached a point where, which was a big hurdle for me, after like about 6 or 7 sessions, I had to really say, this isn't working out, there must be something better. But then I was able to find someone who did specialize more in rape and what happens to people after rape, and it's been the best thing that's happened.
I think talking therapy in some part is always a treatment of choice for PTSD as in other disorders, but the type of talking therapy is what may fluctuate. For example, the talking therapy may move into a more dynamic understanding of what the person experienced and what it means to them. Or it may take a more behavioral direction and go into things such as relaxation procedures or cognitive restructuring, or eventually exposure-based therapies, all of which are talking, but have a different underpinning and a different focus. I frequently will begin with more traditional talking therapies, and when the person and I have established a very genuine relationship where they feel comfortable, we would then consider addressing some of the particular symptoms in a more focused way.
The kind of approach to getting better that I took was to go with a team, and the first person that I saw was a social worker, and she's the person that really is my my main person that I see on a regular basis. I didn't feel like I was being scrutinized in any way. I just felt like I was sort of talking to a friend who really understood, and for me that's what I wanted. I wanted someone who got it, that I didn't have to try to explain to how I was feeling. And she suggested that I go and see a psychiatrist who worked with the team, and that was scary because I think I've always associated kind of taking medication for anxiety or for depression with really having a serious problem. So when I went to see the psychiatrist, I sat down, and the first thing he said, if I can be very blunt, is he said, "This must really suck for you." And I said, "Well, it really does, actually." And from then on, I knew this was really going to be okay. And the next person that I saw who also has made a real integral difference in the way that I've sort of coped with things was a behavioral therapist, a psychologist who specialized in teaching you creative and positive strategies to deal with the startle response and to deal with the anxiety. The most helpful thing for me after having been traumatized like this was to feel like I had a network and a support system that I could count on.
Group therapy has been an important focus of PTSD here at the center and also just in my work. So it would depend on the person's particular situation and what their requests were. But group has been, I think, very helpful in helping trauma victims connect to others and getting some sense of normalization around their experience. So support is very important in helping people to open up and into finding other people either who perhaps can empathize with what they've been through or in some cases have been through what they've been through and may have evolved ways of dealing with it so that they're somewhat better.
But after the trial, I really kind of, and I expected if they got sentenced that I would feel better, if they would get the type of sentence that I thought they deserved, and they did. and I really thought that I would feel better. And after about 2 weeks, what a big letdown. You know, it was like, wow, you know, what do you do now? And that's the time I really realized that I really was going to have to do something to get some type of help. And a woman working in the DA's office had told me that if I needed any assistance in that field, that I could contact her, and I did. And she gave me the name of a few places that I could go in that was having support groups. And when everybody else started saying the thing that they felt, not all exactly what I felt, but very similar. I started putting it together and said, I wasn't crazy after all. That was just a fact of the way you feel when something like that happened, you know. So that helped me more than anything else, was to listen, to get out and be around other people who have experienced that type of thing and able to express themselves.
The new group that I've joined just over the past few months has helped me the most. I had to think before I said that, because I don't like what I feel while being in that group. But I know if I'm able to stick with it, it'll get better. It's a trauma group. There are 3 other people in this group with me. I'm the 4th and newest. Each one of them has a different type of trauma. One other person in there is dealing with a fire issue. The group helps in the sense that I'm able to go in there and cry. And somebody in there will ask me why I'm crying.
And there have been very important advances in the last 10 years or so in understanding what medications to give to people so that every new stress does not get experienced as a traumatic assault.
You know, with the pills, like, the pills help me. If I didn't take the pills, my wife knows right away there's something wrong because of the way I act. I mean, there is a difference between taking the pills and not the pills.
I'm on 2 very small dose of medication now that I take at bedtime. One is for anxiety, the other is for depression. I don't like having to take them. It's a fear that I have, but I know in this particular case, in this sense, it's helping me keep the edge on me, maybe going over the edge.
It's very important for people who have been traumatized to learn to use their bodies as allies again. And to do that, you need to feel that your muscles do work and that you can coordinate your movements in order to do something. Many people who have been traumatized learn that running can be very helpful. Jogging, hiking, swimming, going on outward bound programs.
And I recognized early that exercise was helping me, so I continued to do it. It helped me to release the stress. It helped me to my anxiety, that a lot of things I'd be anxiety about the next day. I would get tensed, and I would just go run 3 or 4 miles and swim, 10 to 15 laps and use the steam and sauna, and I'd have time to just relax my whole body. And I just felt so much better after. I just felt like I got out work and went to the gym. I left the load there.
I really enjoy walking, and especially early in the morning or about sundown in the evening. And discussing this with professional people, it was something that was in fact therapeutic. I found that when I'm walking, I'm thinking positively. I'm doing something that's got my body moving and things like this, and I'm really not thinking a lot of negative thoughts.
I functioned. I lived. I survived. I don't want to be a survivor anymore. I don't want to function anymore. I want to be a human being that lives.
What helps people get better is, and this sounds real sappy, is love. It's a bizarre response, but it's a sense of caring and being cared for, and having a meaningful role to play in the life of people who are still alive, and being able to create something that's worth something for themselves and to other people. It's amazingly simple, it's unbelievably complex.
The real experts on trauma are those individuals who have survived a tragedy. The symptoms of PTSD include those you have just heard about as well as others. If you or someone you know would like further information about PTSD or would like to know how to get help in your area, please contact the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies at 312-644-0828 or the National Organization for Victim Assistance at 202-393-6682.